Welcome. We're really glad you're here. I'm Sara Brumfield with FromThePage, and I'm here today with Ben, my partner. And we wanted to tell you what we've learned from over a decade of running crowdsourcing projects.
So this is one of a series of webinars that we do. We come back to this particular webinar about once every other month. Is that right? Yeah. Every 3 months. So this webinar is geared towards kind of explaining how crowdsourcing projects work for people who are interested in running one themselves. But some of our other ones are deep dives on other projects that we host on FromThePage, or they are deep dives into whatever interests us. Lately, that's been artificial intelligence with primary sources and archival documents.
So you're welcome to join us for any of those as well. So we're going to talk about our platform FromThePage, but a lot of what we talk about is broader than that, can apply to crowdsourcing on any type of platform. Well, what makes crowdsourcing effective? How to think about volunteers, how to select material, how to develop your transcription instructions. We have recommendations for kicking off projects and for keeping your volunteers engaged. And then at the end, we'll have a discussion, answer questions, and kind of show you from the page if you'd like to stick around for that. We will send out a mail at the probably Monday at this point that will have a recording of this and has links to all the resources that we mentioned, so you don't have to scramble to write things down.
So as Sara mentioned, we run a crowdsourcing platform called FromThePage. It specializes in crowdsourcing activities around historic documents, so archival text. Primarily that's transcription, but it could also be indexing, metadata creation, other kinds of tasks that you do based on scanned documents. We are going to be talking in this webinar about some of the soft skills involved in running crowdsourcing projects. So we think that the lessons that we've learned over the last decade and a half can apply to other kinds of tasks or other kinds of materials than the ones that we specialize in. So in brief, our platform FromThePage just allows people to see an image of a document and presents a place for them to transcribe it. We try to keep the technology as simple as possible for users because transcribing text is really hard enough. It's a complicated process. You don't need a lot of technology getting in the way. So we've hosted a lot of pretty successful projects over the years. This is just a handful of the institutions that we've worked with. And some of the things that we've learned from them and from hosting them are what we're going to dive into today. So we're going to talk about effective crowdsourcing, which in our opinion is a collaboration between an institution and the public. Right? And the goal is deep public engagement with special collections and archives and massive metadata creation. So when I say deep engagement, what I mean by this is this. Like, so many institutions nowadays have social media presences that allow them to expose their material very widely with the public. It's a great way to get broad engagement. One of the challenges, though, is that lots of times the only way for the public to engage with that material and with the institution is by clicking a like button or maybe a share, right? So that's great for statistics, but it doesn't let the public share their own passion and expertise back with the institution, right? It doesn't promote discussion around these objects. It's not really a collaboration. So in addition to being about public engagement, deep engagement, crowdsourcing is also about improving metadata for digitized assets in ways that require massive amounts of human interpretation. That doesn't necessarily mean massive numbers of humans or massive numbers of items. It could be just one person who's really passionate, who's going to spend a lot of time working on one particular set of documents. That's the kind of thing, though, that institutional archives and library staff don't really generally have the time to do. right? That the institutions don't commit the resources to do this kind of work, but it is material that members of the public really can help with.
So this is an interesting project because there's not a lot of text, right? When you think of crowdsourcing, often you're thinking about transcription of documents and letters. This one needed a really skilled set of transcribers because it had it was in German, had Latin names of orchids. So if you had those skills, you were golden. And I think they had one transcriber who did most of this work, but it was a really special collection and it needed a really special volunteer, and they found one.
Yeah, but again, you can also imagine that not being the kind of thing that an archive staff who's staring at boxes and boxes of unprocessed documents is going to take the time to do. They're not going to have the time or the priorities to sit down and transcribe an orchidology notebook with all the Latin and all the Greek and all the German in this case,
Yeah.
right? So speaking of archive staff, effective crowdsourcing is really only possible with the guidance and engagement of archive staff, right? You cannot replace staff members with the crowd. It just doesn't work.
So we put a picture of a puppy on the slide because we have this joke that crowdsourcing is free as in puppy. You can find people to do this work for you, but it's like a puppy. You have to take care of it. You actually have a lot of work to do. Volunteers that are participating in these projects don't like to be ignored. They don't like having their work lost. So they're doing something that they feel is meaningful and they're engaging with you. So your half of the contract is to make sure that their work is meaningful and to engage with them. One of our core values at From the Page is meaningful work, because we find that what happens on From the Page is meaningful to volunteers. It's meaningful to the institutions, the archives that run projects. It's very meaningful to us as well. So it's a win all around. It's wonderful.
Yeah, but crowdsourcing is not free labor, right?
Yeah.
It's not free. We have a colleague who sometimes jokes that, oh, you think you're going to get people to do your homework for you, but actually you've been assigned a whole new set of homework to do.
So let's start with volunteers. Because if you don't have volunteers, you're not going to have a successful crowdsourcing project. So I used to have just one slide on this, but now I have 4 because volunteers are really important to crowdsourcing projects. So this is a snapshot of a week on From the Page. This was right after we hit our 2 millionth page transcribed. And over that week, we had 450 volunteers working on the platform. When we look across the year, we have about 5,000 volunteers. That number just keeps going up. The challenge for us is finding more of y'all to bring projects onto the platform to keep those volunteers happy and engaged. We really want that magic to happen. We want you to post your material on From the Page and for one of these wonderful volunteers to find it and start working on it. So we work really hard to help volunteers find interesting, active, well-managed projects, but it isn't always easy. So one of the things that we do is we send out a monthly newsletter that features all the new collections on the platform. But the other thing that you might choose to do, especially if you have things like orchidologist notebooks in German, but really anything that has a lot of local history or genealogy information, is to recruit volunteers that are tied to your location, your material, or your institution, because those volunteers often become your most dedicated volunteers. So there's lots of different ways to find them. This is a picture of the Library of Virginia's volunteers at their annual Transcribiversary. They have a really robust transcription program. They run in-person transcribathons once a month. They do virtual ones once a month. And then once a year, they invite all of their volunteers to come in and they give them t-shirts. They serve them cake and they show them their original primary source documents. You do not have to do all of that. It's just an interesting model of what, a institution that really has doubled down and committed to this does. But what's interesting is to look at this picture and think about the volunteers. We know that our volunteers skew older. Retirees love working on these projects, but Library of Virginia has a lot of students that work with them as well. And so I love just how diverse this crowd is. So when you start thinking about volunteers, you can start by asking, where can we find volunteers? Who will they be? Do you already have volunteers that work with your institutions? Or do you have people who are local who are interested? Maybe your local historical society or your local genealogist would be interested in working with you, because those are often your people that just love having that relationship with your institution and would be happy to do this work to help contribute findability, searchability, more accessible records for your institution. Maybe you're deep on a particular subject matter and you can reach out to communities around that subject matter. So for instance, we did an early project with the Yaquina Head lighthouses that are in Oregon, and they had lighthouse keepers logs for decades, that covered decades, and they were able to engage with lighthouse fans. It turns out there are a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about lighthouses, and they had those people come in virtually and work on transcribing. So when you think about volunteers, you can also think about what material has been most popular with your patrons and why it's popular. So this image is a volunteer with the Missouri State Archives holding her grandfather's birth certificate. Genealogists love projects with names and vital information, even if the material is not as engaging as a diary or a letter. We've seen some very successful projects with heritage organizations, especially the DAR, because many of those organizations have service hour requirements, but they also have members who are very dedicated to causes that dovetail nicely to your job of preserving history. The last thing to realize is that crowdsourcing is not something you're familiar with, probably, but it's also not something your volunteers will be familiar with. It's a bit intimidating, right? So if you think through how you can make it easier for them, that puts you in a good mindset for working with your volunteers. So what we see is that volunteers and transcribers get really into this type of work. It's fun, it's engaging. So this image on the screen represents the most active transcribers on 3 different projects, one at the Indiana Archives, the Library of Virginia, and the California State Archives. And what you see, and this is people who did at least 10 pages. The bulk of their active transcribers were independent, right? They worked on their own, they didn't work on other projects, but there were overlaps, and there are people who went from project to project. These all happen to be World War I material, so you have people who are passionate and interested in World War I. So like Indiana really benefited from another project that was a World War I project that Alabama ran, because they brought their material online very shortly after Alabama had been wrapping theirs up. So you had this group of volunteers who were used to it and interested and worked on their material.
So how do you figure out what material is appropriate for a crowdsourcing project? Volunteers are motivated by a lot of different things. Not every volunteer is motivated by the same thing. So we recommend that you choose material that can tell a good story or provide an immersive experience, or has lots of local history.
You know, the other thing we recommend for first projects,
stuff that's
easy.
Yes, yeah.
You can throw really hard stuff at a volunteer group that's worked on other things because they're not as intimidated. But if you start with something that's really intimidating,
let's just say that it's a lot easier to find volunteers working on typewritten birth certificates than it is to find them that work on colonial court records.
Yes.
So one of the things we look for is material that can tell good stories, right? If you get started reading a diary, you want to turn the page and find out what happens next. So there is this kind of intrinsic motivation that comes from the narrative. Volunteers build a connection with the people and the story. And you can see this in an email that I received in a diary transcription project that I ran. The person who is writing is from a different continent, right? She's the diarist is in Virginia, and the volunteer is in England, and she wants to know what is the matter with one of the people in the diaries, right? She's the diarist is so worried about her and what's going on here. Unfortunately, I did have to tell her that she had stomach cancer and would die a couple of months later. But this kind of passion is very, very motivating. It's not just the connection; it's also the narrative. So letters and diaries provide an immersive experience through through narrative, but they're not the only way to provide that kind of immersive experience. So when the Alabama State Archives indexed their World War I service cards, their collections were organized by county. As a result, volunteers could get a snapshot of their own communities in 1918 as they indexed each service member's name, how old they were, where they enlisted, and what branch they were in. You can also be successful with material that has a lot of local history. The Indianapolis Public Library ran a project transcribing records from Indianapolis public schools. In my opinion, these records are pretty dry, and you can look at this and kind of see that. But they are a genealogical goldmine, and volunteers understand that you can see the people who are in a community at a particular time, when they leave, when they come back, and that attestation, those kinds of records are fantastic.
We also find that if you can give your volunteers a sense of accomplishment, that's very motivating. I think many of us are motivated by checking things off the list. So some of the World War I service cards were so successful because they had a single card and they only collected about 5 fields from each card. So a transcriber could get a lot done. We all like to get stuff done, and that feeling of accomplishment kept them coming back. So that particular project I'm thinking of is the Alabama one that been mentioned, and they had 111,000 World War I service cards, and they transcribed them all in 2.5 months because their material hit so many of these points, and they had such great relationships with their local genealogy and history organizations.
So after you've selected material, the next thing to do is to come up with instructions, right? Define the task that you're asking people to do. For transcription projects, that means giving people instructions on how to transcribe. We call those transcription conventions. And the reason you do that is because the minute anyone encounters a word that's unclear, it's hard to read, or they hit an abbreviation or a spelling that's non-standard, they're going to have questions. So we encourage projects to develop transcription conventions that give instructions to volunteers about what to do when they hit those things. And we'll actually show this on the transcription screen itself. It's right underneath the place that volunteers are typing into, so they can find it if they run into problems. And this example you see on the screen is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, who do a great job documenting these things.
Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that we recommend is that you transcribe a couple of pages yourself for 2 reasons. One is you can upload those as examples, right? Not everybody prints out a manual and reads it beforehand, though a lot of volunteers do. But having an example of what you've done transcribing this can help people out. This also is a fantastic way to develop the transcription conventions, right? Because, we make assumptions about the documents that we have. We make assumptions about the documents that we read. And transcribing documents is a very different kind of task. And you will run into problems as you transcribe them. And if you document those problems, the decisions that you've made, then the volunteers following those documented conventions will preserve this kind of editorial consistency and the accuracy that you're after.
As you go along, you can iterate and change these. So if people ask questions and you're like, oh, I didn't consider that, you can add them. And I think it's totally reasonable to think that you don't have to have a perfect set of transcription conventions out the door, but that you can improve on them. And as you go from project to project, as you build different projects, you can just reuse and modify those conventions. So it does get easier. And you can go look at existing projects on FromThePage and borrow their approaches, and that's totally kosher.
Yes. We do recommend, in addition to trying to transcribe something yourself, go out and grab a few people, maybe people who don't work with historic records. Those could be family members, they could be staff members, and ask them to do that and listen to the questions that they ask you. Document those examples, add those to your instructions. That can really help getting people together to do this. In addition to getting people together to develop your conventions, it's also a great way to launch a project, right? So once you've defined the task, you've selected your material, you're kind of ready to get going, you can host a mini transcribe-a-thon. They are great ways to do outreach. if you bring in people at the very beginning of a project, people who may be leaders within their communities or within their field, people who are active in genealogy organizations or heritage societies, do an in-person transcribe-a-thon. What that does is it lets people get over the initial discomfort with the documents, the discomfort with the task of transcribing, the discomfort with their own level of expertise. Is what I'm doing good enough? Possibly their discomfort with the technology or with your instructions or expectations. And they become much more confident and much more expert, and then they can bring that expertise and that enthusiasm back to their own communities to encourage other people to join in.
This picture is from University of Virginia's 2019 Julian Bond Transcribe-a-thon. So they had students, they had staff members, they had community members all coming to actually 3 different locations.
Yes, this is a location that was on campus, but they also had one location that was out in a coffee house out in the community. It was really cool. So transcribe-a-thons are also something that local media and social media like to highlight. Here's a couple of examples I like to point to. The one on the left is the transcribe-a-thon that was hosted by the New Orleans Jazz Museum. They were working with colonial documents in French. And the interesting thing about this is that this Facebook post is posted by not them, but the French department at Tulane, also in New Orleans, saying, hey, come on by. This is a great way to practice your French and learn about this, right? So other people share these events. On the right-hand side, you see a participant posting saying, check it out. I'm learning how to transcribe Latin documents. It's really neat. So you can also do remote transcribe-a-thons. The communication barrier is higher, but a video conference can be used as a kickoff to walk volunteers through a project, especially with motivated tech-savvy volunteers. This is a great example of a very successful project, transcribe-a-thon, that was done as part of a virtual conference for medievalists. The conference was being held at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies. It was a virtual conference, and to kind of facilitate that kind of hallway conversation, they ran this transcribe-a-thon in parallel, so that you had teams that were working on these documents and transcribing them as they went and collaborating with each other and getting that kind of connection that sometimes we find lacking in virtual conferences.
But you don't have to do a transcribe-a-thon, despite the fact we just spent 4 slides talking about it. But you should definitely kick off your project in some way, some type of outreach or marketing. If you have existing outreach venues, so mailing lists, social media accounts, you should definitely use those and mention and push your project. If you have a physical location, you can do handouts like by a checkout desk or as people walk out the door. You can also look for subject matter enthusiast communities, people who'd be interested in your material and might not be local, but who are interested, right? So on Facebook, you'll find Twitter accounts, there might be magazines. So we have a whole post that we provide in the follow-up email about how to find some of those organizations that might be interested in a particular subject. We've also seen local news channels, both print and television, pick up these projects because they're interesting, they're visual, you have cool documents, you have people they can come in and take pictures of, and they're feel-good stories. They're a way for the local community to contribute to your mission of preserving memories. So this is coverage by the local TV station of a project from the Seattle Municipal Archives. That's Jeannie Fisher, who's their archivist. And isn't it just beautiful with all of her records in the back and, old books in front of her? And yeah, so it was a really neat way to see the local news coverage of her project. We also saw the North Carolina State Archives, when they launched their Colonial Court Records project, they had coverage in 2 large newspapers. It happened to be around the holidays, so those are slow news days, and it brought in a lot of interested volunteers. In fact, those days were the highest number of visits to FromThePage's website that entire year. So this turns out to work really, really well. But once you have your volunteers and you've got your project kicked off and you're starting to get volunteers coming by to work on it, you need to kind of figure out how to keep them engaged. So it's not unusual for volunteers to drop by, transcribe a page, and then you may never see them again. So we have a couple of suggestions for keeping them engaged, because the more you can keep, the more you'll accomplish and faster. So the first one is to welcome new volunteers. So we send out a note every night to every project owner, telling them what's gone on in their collection that day. You'll get something like the screenshot at the bottom with this recent activity, and it shows you when someone has joined your project. You can also go to a collaborator tab and see who joined. You can grab their email addresses if they've opted in, and you can send them an email. It can be a stock email, but letting them know what the project is, what its purpose is. Volunteers really like purpose, and what the material is going to be used for. If you have any training materials or transcription conventions, you can send them links to that, and you can include how to contact you. So you want them to be able to ask you questions or to share something interesting that they have found, or see if they can bring in a group of 20 other people to help you transcribe. Of all of those things, you want them to be able to find you, so make it easy. In addition to welcoming new users, that nightly email will also include comments and questions from your collaborators, from the volunteers who are transcribing for you.
So those can be questions. Lots of times they will be comments. If you look on the right-hand side, the comments from your collaborators, you see, all the notes that were left one day on one of the projects that we run, and you can see that most of these comments in this case are not, hey, I need help with this, but they are, hey, here's this interesting thing that I learned about the material as I was transcribing. Hey, this person is mentioned here, and here was their remaining career after they're mentioned in this book. Right, lots of engagement, this kind of deep sharing of knowledge and expertise is these discussions are one of the places when this happens. But there are also questions, and it's really, really important to answer questions. If you look on the lower left-hand side, you'll see an example from the Lighthouse transcription project that Sarah mentioned earlier. A volunteer, Olivia, has been transcribing. She says there's a lot of activity around a hack. They clean it, they paint it, they varnish it. What is a hack, right? She really, I mean, and I've looked at the history of the edits on this page, and it's obvious that she's not sure if she's misreading the word, and eventually she decides that actually it is H-A-C-K, hack. But what is it? So the people running the project, when she left that email, of course, they get that in their nightly activity report, and they responded immediately, and they said, we don't know, right? And that is wonderful, right? That is one of the best possible examples. It's definitely a best practice, is to respond to volunteers when they have questions, even if you don't know the answer. Because the minute that they put that down there, Olivia, the volunteer, got an email saying, well, we don't know, but nice find, we're not sure what's going on, but she knows that there's somebody on the other end of the line. She's not just asking questions into a void. There are people who care about her work. This is a real collaboration. And the next day, they came back again and said, we figured it out. A hack boat is a general purpose boat. You could use it for maintenance or anything like that. Totally appropriate if you're living in a lighthouse.
So in addition to responding to those questions, we encourage you to include your contact information. We have a footer that shows up on every page of your project. So this is an example from the LA County Library, and they link to their Facebook, their Twitter, their Instagram, and that questions contact us is a mail to link. So you can email them if you have questions. A lot of us don't like to look stupid in public, so we might not leave a note or a question on the page, but we might reach out over email, because that's a little bit less vulnerable,
And there may be other kinds of contributions that people make. I know that there have been a couple of times now that we've been contacted by volunteers who can't find the contact info for the institution they're working on, saying, hey, we've got related material that we would like to donate to the archives. So that's something that's not really appropriate for a comment thread, but it could be really valuable.
Then the last thing we recommend is that you send a newsletter. It doesn't have to be complicated. Our attitude is that something is better than nothing, and doing something as often as you can. If you have a really active project, once a month would be great. But if you only get to it once a quarter, that's okay too. If you feel like your project has stagnated, that might be a good time to send one. And you can pull in a list of your collaborator emails, and you could just put them in your email client, or you could use something fancier like MailChimp or Constant Contact. And we have a blog post that we'll send out that gives a lot of different examples of what people will do for crowdsourcing project newsletters. They'll highlight interesting finds. They'll talk about volunteers hitting particular milestones. There's a lot of things that you can do to make it interesting. So something else to think about. So, the way we look at it is that every institution benefits from the work done by our volunteers, but the entire historical community benefits from increased public awareness and appreciation for what archives and public history institutions do. So crowdsourcing invites our citizens to join in that work and gives them a sense of responsibility for the past that we all share. It gives them a direct and personal connection to the people who made that history, and they have a desire to support and protect the institutions that preserve it. So this is important work. It's meaningful work. So that's all we have as a formal presentation for you today. But if you're even a little bit inspired, I'd encourage you to act on that. So we're trying something new that we're calling quick start calls. If you want to bring 200 pages or less, PDFs, images, either one is fine. We can work with you to get your project configured and launched. There's no strings attached, really. It's 200 pages that can stay up for as long as they need to. And we'll actually feature them in one of our monthly newsletters that go out to all of our volunteers. And you can see how this works, how it goes, how interested people really are in this material. So you can start imagining how to make it part of your archives work. That link plus resources and a recording will all be in an email that we'll send out by Monday.
So that's the end of our formal presentation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and we can open the floor up for questions and answers. And then if there's time at the end, we can do a demo from the page for anyone who's interested. So let me stop sharing. So if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or add them in the chat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll take a sip of coffee while we
Quiet group today. Do you want to start showing? So if you have more questions that occur to you, please do not hesitate to ask. We're going to go ahead and share our screen and show you a little bit of some real live projects.
Okay, so we want to start sharing. And again, please go ahead and interrupt anytime. Close this window thing. Okay, so we're just going to start by transcribing part of a letter. So this letter is from the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Alabama paper project. It is going to be kind of a hard one, but we're gonna do what we can. All right, so with From the Page, you just have, as we said, the ability to see an image next to a place to type. We're going to make this a little bit larger by moving the image to the top so we can see it a little bit better. So we're going to start with Bragg's Station,
Okay.
June 22nd, 62.
That says.
Governor John G. Schroeder. Here, sir.
Was elated.
I was elected.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, during Lieutenant Colonel of the 55th ALA.
Have applied. I think have applied.
Have made Application. Okay. So we're going to hit save on this.
Then you're gonna go fix everything you got wrong,
Oh,
right?
what did I get wrong?
Okay, it's the 53rd, not the 55th, I believe.
Okay, 53rd.
You misspelled commission, and I think he got it right, so down 2 lines.
Mission. I'm not able to get. Okay, so we are gonna save the fixes. And one of the things that my typos are going to let us do is show how versioning works. Every time we hit the save button, we saved a new version of this document. So you can see the first version, you have the Alabama Department of Archives and History uploads material that's blank. And then we've got a version by me with the material that I've added, all in green. And then the most recent version is, you can see the changes that I made with the red for deletions and green for new things that were added. We're going to pause for a moment.
Go read this question from Scotty
Bellend. Are there any crowdsourcing platforms you recommend for working with images? I have many photos from the American Indian Movement protest occurring in the country across the 70s. There are some captions which may help with transcriptions, but I'm more interested in identifying figures in the images. I've shown some of the photos to a tribal member of the Piscataway Indian Nation. He identified quite a few figures that are not identified in the captions. I think it'd be important and helpful to contextualize the time in history.
So, we have, that's okay. Photo identification. I think you have a good project for photo identification, but photo identification is often hard because if it's too broad and your volunteers are too broad, you end up with people saying, oh, that looks like my grandpa. Because everybody's grandpa, you go back 100 years, everyone has the same style and the same hairstyle and facial hair and things like that. Where we've seen it very successful is when you have a set of images that are nicely constrained to a type of activity. So what Ben has on the screen is a project.
Oh, they've finished the project.
They finished the project
Okay.
up. A project from why don't you look for dance posters?
Okay, yeah, that's a good example. That's a very parallel example.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much they ask about identification, but okay, the indie project here, they had this set of photographs that Indianapolis Public Library had them, but they knew they were of indie parks. And so they put them up and they asked people which park it was. So you had a controlled vocabulary with a drop down of all the parks. And then they asked them why they thought so. And that was where it got really interesting because why I thought this was this particular park. Sometimes you get like Google Street View saying, this isn't actually a park, but if you look here, this is exactly the same building in the same intersection. So we know where it is, and here's the park that's closest to it.
I mean, people were using Google to recreate the photo and say, well, here's what this looks like today,
Right.
Which was pretty powerful. Do you want to explain how this
Sure,
project
yeah.
works?
This project's a really interesting one. So this is at Ohio University, and they have a collection of dance posters. And so they're not, you can transcribe a dance poster. This one has no text, but sometimes they do. But they have, instead of doing a transcription project, they're doing a metadata project. So they're asking what's happening in the image. And they're like, there are no wrong answers. Describe the movement, add context, add dancer information, any other details that and they've reached out to their alumni community of their dance program, who are the people who are probably in these pictures or remember this performance or know more about it, right?
Yeah, they were there when it happened, much like the people who you're talking to, Scotty.
Yeah.
Right, and so they have, in this case, a controlled vocabulary of dancers that they already know about that people can choose from. And then they're also saying, if there are people we didn't mention, list the dancers here, right? So, this isn't the same as kind of, Facebook style tagging people's faces. You get data that is potentially has more context. It kind of depends on what you're asking for.
And in this particular case, you would need to do that outreach to the people who were there, but it sounds like you already have. So I think it's a great candidate for this type of project.
Right. Yeah, the University of Maryland. The University of Maryland already uses FromThePage and has a subscription. So if you talk to the University of Maryland archives or
Send us an email.
yeah,
We'll help
just
you
send us
find
an
the right
email.
people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're not already hooked up with them.
Yeah, we will connect you to the people, the FromThePage people at University of Maryland.
So, Ben showed kind of our initial transcription, which is a kind of textual transcription, wherever we were with that one, this one. And then the one we just looked at was a metadata project. So you can create metadata for items, whether they're one page or multiple pages. You can combine those two things and you can transcribe letters and create metadata. But then we have some other types of transcription projects that people do.
Right. So this is very different from the from the Civil War governor's example, right? You would not want to, you might want to have this transcribed so you could print it, read it, maybe do some searches on it. This project by the Missouri State Archives, working with their index to their criminal court records, it's structured data, right? They want this data in a database and a finding aid, and they want these fields kind of separated out and made in almost
Index. It's an index.
Yeah, it is fundamentally an index into these index cards. So what they've done is used a feature we call field-based indexing, in which they lay out a document. The image, oh, there's the image. I zoomed strangely. So they lay out a form with fields that are the ones they're looking for, right? And so they have the ability to have a bit of a controlled vocabulary about some of these things. Also dates, for example, are, they can say, oh, this is a date kind of field, this is a numeric kind of field. But they've produced this form and configured it to match the layout of the original index card. And we have found that actually tremendously improves volunteer accuracy because their eyes don't skip around going between the top left part of the form you're trying to have them fill in from data and the bottom right part of the image, right? So it's a really interesting and successful project so far.
When they export this, they export it as spreadsheets. They can also push it as text if you wanted to, have a system where you just see the text of the card next to it. But also, it's interesting that you can pull it out as a spreadsheet and use it in an index or for a data set or something.
So this is another example that's a little bit different. It's also structured data, but the data itself, if we take a look at this, these are county tax rolls for taxpayers in Florida, and this is before emancipation. So there's white male people, there's enslaved people, there's land, there's valuations. So what they've done here is use spreadsheet transcription. So there are a handful of header fields. What county is it? We would type in Alapa or Alachua. Possibly is the page regular or not? And then they've laid out a spreadsheet with the columns that they're interested in. Again, kind of matching the layout of the form itself, right? So name and the relevant columns. When they export this, it will also come out as a spreadsheet with all of the data in the collection or in the document all stitched together.
With the header information on each line.
Right. So the last thing that we wanted to kind of dive in on from the transcriber perspective is being able to transcribe material, but also do item level metadata creation. So let me find an example that has more than one page. This is a project at Dartmouth that is transcribing these Arctic exploration logs. So someone is transcribing, right? They transcribe a page, they transcribe the next page, and then at the end of transcribing this document, they are prompted to produce metadata, structured metadata about the item. So you see there's instructions on how to interpret this and how to fill out the form at the very top of the screen. And then they've got, who is the author, who's the recipient, what kind of document is it? Is it a telegram or a letter? What's the date? And this can be exported as a spreadsheet with one row per document. Are there other questions? I want to kind of pause. That's kind of the end of the transcriber facing functionality.
Getting material into from the page is very easy. We don't necessarily have to show it, but you just upload a zip file of images, or you upload a PDF that has page images in it. Or if you have a system that produces IIIF manifests, which is a great interoperability format, you can just copy that link in and we'll pull references to all the images in. So we have some integrations. We have integrations with Content DM and with the Internet Archive. So there's we try to make it as easy as possible for you to get your material in. And then we wouldn't say it's easy to get out because we have like 25 different export formats, which Ben could show you, I guess. But we try to give you everything you could possibly want or need in terms of getting it out and putting it someplace else. A lot of people actually choose to keep their projects on from the page and maybe make them inactive so no new work happens on them, because their downstream systems don't necessarily have really great display of transcription. And we actually offer that as kind of a freebie, even after you've, if your subscription is not active, you can still keep your material online read only.
Oh.
We do not want something about using.
Yes, no, okay. We're not gonna jump into the we're not gonna jump into the PDF right now, and nobody wants to see me download Acrobat. But yeah, more straightforward export formats. So here's a diary page, and we can pull it out. PDF, Microsoft Word. We can pull it out in IIIF. We can send it to a visualization tool like Voyant to analyze the document. And see kind of what are the things that people were talking about in this diary from a tobacco farm, unsurprisingly tobacco. And then there's a wide range of other export formats that we support. TEI XML, plain text, HTML, and then as Sarah mentioned, many others, right?
Hopefully everything you could possibly.
So that's really everything that we have to demo, unless anyone wants us to kind of dive more deeply on any of the things that we've showed off or any of the topics we've brought up. Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it, and we're always happy to chat.
Yeah, we're happy to brainstorm project ideas. We're happy to hand hold you through getting material up just to experiment. Anything you need.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, or have a good evening, Janine.